Hey folks, so today what I want to try to cover real quickly is how to measure and figure out the code for fan belts, drive belts of all sorts in the event that you don't have the information on the belt or you don't know what it was originally. And I'm going to kind of talk through the process of figuring out how to do that and then order the correct size belt for your application. Now, there are three primary categories of V-belts or drive belts. There's the classical, the narrow wedge, and the fractional horsepower. The classical V-belts have a load range between 1 to 500 horsepower, and you may see these on older lower horsepower engines. They have a standard profile angle of about 40 degrees. They have belt width usually starting around a ½ inch and moving up to 1.5 inches, maybe a little larger. Now here's something to be aware of. The fractional horsepower belts are designed for light duty applications under 1 horsepower, hence fractional horsepower. Now they look just like your narrow wedge belts. You don't want to mix these up. They are not interchangeable. If you use a fractional horsepower belt on a higher rated engine like 320, 289, what have you, you're running the risk of blowing that belt out and either damaging your engine or your accessories. So make sure you're not getting an FHP belt. The narrow wedge belts have a 30-degree angle profile and cover a range of 1 to 1,000 horsepower. So for classic cars from the mid-60s onward up to more modern cars in the 90s and maybe the early 2000s, the narrow wedge V-belt is your automotive drive belt. Now, there are differences between the belts within a category. So, for example, here is a cogged belt. This is a smooth belt. Now, a smooth belt is said to transfer the energy more efficiently and more completely throughout your drive. So if you have 3 pulleys, this smooth belt, you're transferring all the energy to the pulleys because there are no gaps and it's a solid belt. For the cogged belt, they're supposed to handle heat transfer much better, meaning they dissipate the heat and they operate therefore at a lower temperature. It keeps the belt from wearing out prematurely. I'm not an engineer. I can't attest to any of this. I can only repeat what I've been taught. There are advantages to each, and I would say you guys just have to figure out what you choose to use. It's your call. I use the cogged belt. So first up, if you have the existing belt, you can use a tape measure to measure the width, the depth, and the outside circumference of the belt. Now for some, they say that they'll take their tape measure and hold it in one spot and just kind of work their way around the belt until they come back. You know, they'll mark it, whatever. This is how I do it. I simply take the old belt off. I'm not going to use it again, and I just cut it. Okay, there you go. So now you have a single length of your belt. Then I just start at one end and work my way around. And in the case of this belt, it is 51 inches. To measure the width of the belt, I simply run my tape along the width, and right there, it looks like it is roughly 5/8 of an inch. It's a pretty worn out belt, but I think when you get rid of the frayed edges and everything, that would work itself out to just about 5/8. Then you want to measure the depth of the belt, and the depth of the belt here, I believe, is running just at about 3/8 of an inch. So that's how to measure if you already have a belt. Now, if you don't have a belt, you can consult the owner's manual or go to a parts store or a website, feed your information into the system, and hopefully you'll get back the appropriate size belt. With those two options, I find them to be a little bit inefficient. Oftentimes, especially with older classic cars, you may have an engine that has been modified or changed out in some way. So whatever the original OEM was calling for may no longer work on that particular engine. The third process, and that's the process that I use, is I simply measure the width and depth of the pulleys. And in measuring for width, I'm simply measuring the space between the edges of the pulley as well as the depth of the pulley. Now, you may have some wear marks, wear lines in your pulley that kind of give you an estimate of how deep the belts run on that particular pulley in routing. However, if you don't, you'll just have to estimate as best you can. Now, to try to find the length of a missing belt, you can use a 1/4 inch thick piece of line that roughly approximates the thickness of a belt, and you wrap it around the 2 or 3 pulleys. Simply measure that piece of rope, and that'll give you an estimate or your belt length. If you don't have something that can approximate the thickness of a belt, then what you want to try to do then is use just a piece of string, wrap it around your pulleys, and measure it the same way. But be aware that in going deeper into the pulleys, you may have to add an extra 1/2 or inch, maybe even 1.5 inches to that estimated belt length. The other thing that you want to keep in mind is you want to double check where the adjustment brackets are, especially for an engine that's missing the belts. If the adjustment brackets have been adjusted all the way out, then you definitely want to move them back to center. That'll give you enough of an accurate measure that you can move the accessory in order to install the belt, and then still have enough on the outside so that as the belt stretches, you'll be able to then tighten that belt as it goes. So remember, make sure that as you're measuring that you set those brackets in the middle. Okay, so now you have your measurements, and now it's time to then take your measurements and convert them into a code that you can then take down to the auto parts store or online and order the appropriate belt. For our needs, I'm going to focus on converting our measurements to the Narrow Wedge V-Belt. This type of belt is identified by the first 2 characters, and starting off generally with a 3 and going up from there in 1/8 inch increments. So for example, a belt code starting in 3 would be 3/8 inch, a 4 would be a 1/2 inch, 5 would be 5/8 inch, and so on. The next character is a letter, either an L or a V. The V for Victor is what identifies a narrow wedge belt, and that's what you're looking for. So, for example, if you have a 3/8 inch width and you need that narrow wedge belt, you're going to write your code as a 3 Victor. That's what it would start with. If you choose to use a cogged belt, then you're going to place an X after the Victor. So if you have a 3/8 inch width cogged narrow wedge belt, it's going to read 3 Victor X-ray or 3VX. That's what you're going to start with. Finally, your next number is going to be your length, and that's what you're going to plug in. In this case, we measured that previous belt to be 51 inches. So a 3/8 inch width cogged belt that's 51 inches long would read 3 Victor X-ray 5-1. And I'll say that again. So your code would read 3 Victor X-ray 5-1, and you may add a 0 to the end of that depending, but that's a simple way of taking your measurements and converting them into the standard fan belt code. Now, having said that, when you go to your auto parts store, their belts may be measured in millimeters or centimeters. As an example, here I have two different labels or 2 different packages from 2 different auto parts store. They're both listed in metrics. This one says 11 Alpha Victor, so it's a narrow wedge belt, which is what we would be looking for, and 1370 is the length. You can convert that to metric if you choose. I don't really deal with metric. I'm too old to really care. So again, just to recap, if you do have your belt, great. You may be able to find the code printed on it, but if you don't, no worries. Now you know how to measure it. You measure your width, you measure your depth, and then you measure your outside circumference. As for not having a belt, you can measure the width and depth of your pulleys and then run a line around the pulleys and determine an estimated measurement for your belt. We also covered how you can take those measurements and plug them into the Narrow Wedge V-Belt code for an automotive drive belt. Again, so a 3/8 inch belt cogged, and that is 51 inches long, would read 3 Victor for narrow wedge, X-ray or X for cogged, and then 5-1 or 510 for 51 inches. Now, again, you can convert that to metric if you choose. I don't. If you have any questions, please hit me in the comments below. If you found this video to be of value to you, please hit like and subscribe, and also, put any comments below that you feel might make these videos or help me make this channel better. in the future, I would be greatly appreciative. And again, thanks for joining me on this journey as I jump into being an entry-level hot rod mechanic.